Those were her sorrowful words following the June 1876 death of her husband, George Armstrong Custer, at the Little Bighorn, a one-time boy general with whom she had shared a grand and tragic romance. On the evening of July 5, 1876, the paddle-wheel steamer Far West, helmed by Captain Grant Marsh, arrived in Bismarck, Dakota Territory. Across the Missouri River at Fort Abraham Lincoln, the wives of the post's absent soldiers heard an ominous whistle blast from the steamer as it docked. A sense of gloom had enveloped the post for days, fueled by rumors brought by Indians of a great and disastrous battle far to the west. Several officers' wives gathered at the Custer home, staying past midnight before returning to their respective quarters. They had also congregated there on Sunday afternoon, June 25th, seeking solace with each other and finding comfort in the singing of hymns. At dawn on July 6th, the Far West loosened its moorings, finally drifting downstream to the fort. Elizabeth, upon hearing a knock on the back door and a voice requesting the cook to summon the lady of the house, quickly donned her dressing gown and rushed downstairs. In the parlor, Captain William McCaskey of the 20th Infantry, accompanied by the post surgeon and another officer, awaited her. Joined by her sister-in-law Margaret Calhoun and niece Emma Reed, Elizabeth listened with composure as McCaskey read the dispatch he had received from Brig. General Alfred Terry, Lilt Colo, George Armstrong Custer, and every officer and man of 5 companies of the 7th U.S. Cavalry had been killed in battle at the Little Bighorn River on June 25, 1876. The captain remembered that hour as the most difficult of his life, but he asked for her shawl so that she could accompany him to inform the post's other new widows. As they descended the steps of the Custer home, Margaret Calhoun followed. "Is there no message for me?" she cried. Having lost her husband, 3 brothers, and a nephew, all McCaskey could say was, they had all died fighting. The young son of Captain George Yates, a couple greatly favored by the Custers, played in his yard when another boy shouted, "Hey George, your father's had his head cut off by Indians." The heartless child soon discovered that his own father had also fallen to the Plains Indians at the Little Bighorn. The widows and their children eagerly sought any details about the battle. Elizabeth conveyed her desire to talk with Captain Marsh, as he was one of the last to converse with her husband. Marsh, renowned for his courage all along the Missouri, couldn't bring himself to see her. Colonel Nelson Miles, who would soon inherit Custer's reputation as an Indian fighter, did the widow and wrote to his wife that she was depressed and in such despair. Libbie, as George affectionately referred to her during their seemingly perfect 12-year marriage, no longer had a spot in the army and had to quickly leave her residence. She would be granted a widow's pension of $30 per month. Her husband had recently acquired a $5,000 policy with the New York Life Insurance Corps. That, along with her memories, constituted all she possessed. She even had to part with their numerous dogs. The Northern Pacific Railroad arranged for Elizabeth to have a special eastbound car from Bismarck. Joining her were Margaret Calhoun, Mrs. A. Smith, and Mrs. George Yates, along with Mrs. Yates' 3 small children and her brother, Richard Roberts. Annie Yates was the daughter of W. Milner Roberts, chief engineer of the Northern Pacific, and her brother had set out with the 7th for the Little Bighorn as a correspondent, only to be saved when his horse broke down. Reached Monroe, Mich. on August 4th. Elizabeth retreated to her childhood home in Monroe, isolating herself from the world. Numerous letters arrived, including one from Commanding General William T. Sherman, emphasizing the greater meaning of her sacrifice. He was engaged in a war as necessary as any which history delights to record. A war between civilization and barbarism. A war between the peaceful agriculturalist and the savage hunter. When in years to come the Yellowstone becomes the highway of travel between the East and the West, when peaceful farmers and gardeners occupy the valley of the Rosebud and Bighorn, people will point to the spot where Custer and his brave companions fell that they and their children might live in peace. Lawrence Barrett, the renowned American stage actor who had been her husband's closest friend outside of the army, paid her a visit. She briefly conversed with him but mostly declined to see anyone else, expressing to a friend, "A wounded thing must with him but mostly declined to see anyone else," expressing to a friend, "A wounded thing must hide." In the wintry darkness of her childhood home, she immersed herself in memories. Elizabeth Bacon was formally introduced to Captain George A. Custer in late November 1862 at a party at Monroe's Boyd Seminary. He was smitten, she was courteous. He hailed from the wrong side of the tracks, while she was the only child of prominent citizen Judge Daniel Bacon. Although he was handsome, charming, and a member of Maj. General George McClellan's staff, his chances for survival, let alone advancement, were slim. The judge was unamused by the young officer's attentions to his only daughter. Both the judge and Elizabeth worried about Custer's reputation as a womanizer, gambler, and drinker, although he eventually gave up drinking. "He is nothing to me," she confided to a friend. "He never will be." Captain's rank. In 1863, shortly after Brigadier General Joseph Hooker assumed command of the demoralized army, which had recently suffered defeat by Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Fredericksburg, Hooker appointed Alfred Pleasonton as his cavalry chief. Pleasonton chose young Custer for his staff. As his new aide, Custer excelled in gathering intelligence, displayed daring and fearlessness in combat, and was charming around the evening campfire. He quickly became a favorite at cavalry headquarters. When Pleasonton decided to inject new energy into his command, he recommended Custer for promotion to Brigadier General of Volunteers. On June 28, 1863, at the age of 23, Custer assumed command of the 1st, 5th, 6th, and 7th Regiments of the Michigan Volunteer Cavalry Brigade. Within a week, the newly promoted general made his debut in the greatest and most significant battle ever fought on American soil. The newly promoted general made his debut in the greatest and most significant battle ever fought on American soil. Decked out in a black velvet jacket adorned with gold braid from elbow to cuffs, velvet trousers featuring twin gold stripes tucked into high-topped boots, all topped off with a crimson scarf and a broad-brimmed hat adorned with a single star. He was a remarkable sight. However, Custer was more than just a flashy display. On the crucial third day of Gettysburg, he led his cavalry brigade against Maj. General J.E.B. Stuart's renowned Confederate horsemen, who were attempting to flank the Union right as Pickett's charge pounded against Brig. General George Meade's center. "Come on, you Wolverines!" George shouted from the head of the column as he led them in the wild charge that handed Stuart's men their first taste of defeat at the hands of Yankee steel. The press was quick to praise the virtues of this boy general. As Libbie Bacon read these accounts, each one broke down her feeble defenses. "I read about him in all my books," she gushed. "When I delve into the heroes of literature, my life hero, my dear boy general, comes dashing in with them." A minor leg wound in September 1863 earned Custer a 15-day leave back to Monroe. At a masquerade ball on September 28th, Libbie confessed her love to him. Yet one formidable obstacle still stood in their way: Judge Bacon. Two of Custer's staff officers, Jacob Green and George Yates, were sent back to Monroe to recover from illness and served as spies for the young suitor. Custer had written the judge, seeking permission to pursue his suit, but received no reply. "I think the leaven is at work and may leaven the old lump after a while if it is not interfered with," Green assured his anxious friend. "Keep cool and steady." Finally, weeks later, Bacon's Custer was perplexed by the judge's cautious response, but Libbie was overjoyed. "My prospects are so bright now," she wrote in her journal. "Father is more than reconciled, and mother is getting to look more favorably. They both joke with me about the dear man. And I am happy. Every other man seems so ordinary beside my own bright particular star." They married in Monroe's First Presbyterian Church on February 9, 1864. It was the grand social event of the year, if not the century, in Monroe. The newlyweds traveled through Cleveland to New York and Washington, D.C., but cut their honeymoon short when Custer was recalled to the front. Libbie, refusing to leave her husband, found herself quartered in a commandeered farmhouse some 5 miles south of Brandy Station, almost within sight of the Confederate lines. It was here she met Eliza. Eliza Brown had found her way into the Union lines in Virginia's Rappahannock County in August 1863. This young contraband girl, as the Yankee soldiers called escaped or liberated slaves, joined the Custers as a cook and housekeeper. She was an extraordinary woman, possessing both grit and grace, and she fully understood her role in the significant events that unfolded in her life. "Well, Miss Libbie," she later confided, "I set in to see the war, beginning and end. I didn't sit down to wait to have 'em all free me. I helped to free myself. I was all ready to step to the front whenever I was called upon, even if I didn't shoulder the musket." Eliza was pleased with the general's bride and promptly took her under her wing. Despite being about the same age as Elizabeth, Eliza became a mother figure to her. "I imagine she did so much mothering in those days, when she comforted me in my loneliness and quieted me in my frights," Libbie later recalled. "That I counted her old even then." In March 1864, Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant as the commanding general of Union forces. Custer settled Libbie in a room at Hyatt's 6th Street boarding house in Washington, while he anxiously awaited the anticipated changes in the Army of the Potomac. Dealing with his new division commander, Grant's favorite James H. Wilson, and the new cavalry commander, Major General Philip Sherita, Custer navigated the military scene. Meanwhile, Elizabeth safeguarded his interests by socializing with senators, congressmen, generals, and other government officials in the capital. At various upscale Washington gatherings, she gracefully deflected the advances of influential men while always promoting her husband's career. Advancement in the Army wasn't solely achieved by sword skills, and Libbie proved to be a valuable asset. W. Kellogg escorted her to a levee at the White House where, in the Blue Room, he introduced Custer's wife to President Abraham Lincoln. The president, completely charmed, held on to Libbie's hand as he exclaimed, "So this is the young woman whose husband goes into a charge with a whoop and a shout. Well, I'm told he won't do so anymore." Blushing, Libbie assured the commander-in-chief that marriage would not dull her husband's daring. "Oh, then you want to be a widow, I see," he remarked with a chuckle. She laughed as well, assuring the president that he would have gained a vote if soldiers' wives were allowed one. While Libbie safeguarded the political rear, Custer rode to glory on the front lines. He and Sheridan quickly developed a strong bond. In no time, Little Phil became Custer's mentor and chief advocate. Sheridan admired Custer's audacity, aggressiveness, and even marveled at his style. The hard-bitten Sheridan noted, if there was any poetry or romance in war, he could develop it. Sheridan's cavalry rapidly swept south, pushing to the very gates of Richmond, where at Yellow Tavern, one of Custer's troopers killed the Confederate cavalry legend Stuart. In early June, Major General Wade Hampton, the new Confederate cavalry commander, trapped Custer's brigade at Trevilian Station, and the boy general had to cut his way out, leaving Eliza and his baggage train behind. Reaching U.S. Grant's lines at Cold Harbor, Custer was elated when his faithful servant rejoined him, but he remained disheartened over the loss of his personal baggage and all of Libbie's letters to him. "I regret the loss of your letters more than all else," he told his wife. "I enjoyed every word you wrote, but do not relish the idea of others amusing themselves with them, particularly as some of the expressions employed. Somebody must be more careful hereafter in the use of double entendre." Libbie stood firm, as her boundless passion for him knew no limits. "I suppose some rebel is devouring my letters," she replied. "No Southerner could say, if they are gentlemen, that I lacked refinement. There can be nothing base between man and wife if they love each other. What I wrote was holy and sacred." He yielded to her, responding, "I live for you, dear girl, and seek to establish a name among our country's defenders that in after years we and ours may claim with pride. But now I love and am loved. That is all I ask." In early June, the lovers briefly reunited at City Point, Va. Here, Libbie met Sheridan for the first time, and the Bantam Irishman was instantly captivated by her charms. His usual practice was to ban officers' wives from camp, as domestic tranquility and life in the field often clashed. However, he always made an exception for Libbie. "Custer," he later declared, "you are the only man." Lee now dispatched Lieutenant General Jubal Early up the Shenandoah Valley with 12,000 men to menace Washington and divert Union troops from the Richmond front. Early quickly found success, pushing aside Union forces and advancing to the very outskirts of the capital. Grant, resolute in closing off the Shenandoah to the rebels once and for all, assigned Sheridan with 40,000 men to defeat Early and devastate the valley. In September, Sheridan's troopers dislodged the rebels from their positions at Winchester and delivered a decisive blow at Fisher's Hill. In both battles, Custer and his Wolverines played a prominent role, taking over 700 prisoners and capturing 7 battle flags. Sheridan rewarded him with command of his 3rd Cavalry Division. As they moved south through the Shenandoah, they left destruction in their wake. Sheridan boasted that a Crow would be compelled to carry his own rations when crossing the once fertile valley. The people of the valley dubbed Custer and his men Sheridan's robbers. At Cedar Creek on October 19, 1864, Early's forces caught the Yankees off guard while Sheridan was away. The general, returning from a conference in Washington, quickly rode toward the sound of the guns, an episode soon celebrated in poems, songs, and art. Sheridan's dramatic arrival shifted the tide on the battlefield, inspiring his beleaguered army to rally and defeat the enemy. The cavalry led by Custer and Merritt had maintained the Union line as the infantry retreated in panic, and now they charged into the weakening rebel lines. That evening, Sheridan's favorite horse galloped up to his chief's tent, lifting his commander off his feet and dancing a jig around the campfire. "By God, Phil," Custer laughed. "We've cleaned them out of their guns and got ours back." Sheridan rewarded his protege with a trip to visit Washington. He captured battle flags to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. With Libbie present, the proud cavalryman handed over the flags to the secretary, who responded by announcing Custer's promotion to Major General. Although a brevet or honorary promotion, it allowed Custer to wear 2 stars on his shoulders and hat. Sheridan quickly headed south to rejoin Grant for the final assault on Lee's army. In the intense campaigning that followed, Custer's division was always at the forefront. At Dinwiddie Courthouse, 5 Forks, and Sailor's Creek, Custer's men inflicted a heavy toll on the rebels. At Sailor's Creek, Custer's 20-year-old brother Tom, a lieutenant on his staff, seized a rebel banner and brought it back to the Union lines despite being shot in the face. For his daring bravery, Tom Custer would receive his 2nd Medal of Honor. On April 8, 1865, George Custer's division intercepted and destroyed supplies and guns intended for Lee's line of retreat. As he organized his division for another charge the next morning, a Confederate horseman approached Custer under a flag of truce to announce that General Lee wished to meet with General Grant. It was over. Custer accompanied Sheridan to Wilmer McLean's house at Appomattox Courthouse. Following the surrender, Sheridan gave McLean a $20 gold piece in exchange for the table on which Grant had drafted the surrender terms. He gifted the table to Custer as a present for Libbie, later sending her a note. "My dear madam, I respectfully present to you the small writing table on which the conditions for the surrender of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia were written by Lieutenant Grant. And permit me to say, madam, that there is scarcely an individual in our service who has contributed more to bring about this desirable result than your very gallant husband." Libbie outpaced the army in reaching Richmond, where she joined Michigan Senator Zachariah Chandler, and a congressional delegation visiting the Confederate capital. On the night of April 11th, she stayed in Jefferson Davis's bedroom, and the following night in his wife Verena's room, where George found her upon his return. Although he had to go back to his division, she accompanied him. He entrusted her with the Appomattox surrender flag, a white towel, the small table, and a captured rebel horse named Custis Lee. Upon hearing of Lincoln's assassination on April 14th, Libbie returned to Washington as the troops prepared for action. Sheridan was quickly dispatched south by Grant to counter a feared alliance between ex-Confederates and French imperialists in Mexico, raising the prospect of conflict on the Rio Grande. Custer received orders to join him, and immediately after the May 23rd Grand Review in Washington, he and his staff, accompanied by Libbie and Eliza, traveled by train and steamboat to New Orleans. After a challenging time in Louisiana, where Custer's new troops displayed mutinous behavior, they headed west into Texas, ultimately setting up headquarters in Austin. By November, the threat of war with the French had dissipated, and they settled into occupation duties. During this delightful period in Austin, local admirers gifted Custer with several large hunting hounds. One of them, Byron, became such a favorite that he joined the young couple in bed every night, much to the dismay of Eliza, who threatened to write to Custer's mother about this lapse in his duties as a husband. Eliza was satisfied when Byron made the mistake of growling at Libbie one night as they vied for bed space. Custer intervened, kicking the dog off the bed and momentarily appeasing Eliza. Less assertive hounds soon took his place, and for Libbie, the bedroom skirmish continued without resolution. Immediately after Appomattox, Custer earned a promotion to Major General of Volunteers. However, as of February 1866, that army ceased to exist, and he was mustered out, reverting to his regular Army rank of Captain, 5th Cavalry. While Libbie returned to Monroe, Custer traveled to Washington to advocate for a command. He visited Stanton, securing commissions in the regular service for George Yates and his brother Tom, but his own future remained uncertain. He then journeyed to New York City to explore various business offers. Enjoying the company of wealthy capitalists, he attended the theater and extravagant parties with them. He wrote to Libbie expressing his yearning for her and suggested they go for horseback rides in the park, stating, "You know I am a great advocate of exercise as a promoter of good health. Well, I firmly believe that I require a ride every morning before breakfast." However, he also wrote to her about bantering with prostitutes, or nymphes du pavé as he called them, and attending a dinner where he was seated next to a beautiful baroness. The baroness wore a very handsome satin, and oh so low. I sat beside her on a sofa, and I have not seen such sights since I was weaned, and yet it did not make my angry passions rise, nor nothing else. While assuring Libbie, "At no time did I forget you," he also exhibited a compulsive need to prove to her how attractive he was to other women. In May 1866, Sheridan secured Custer a brevet promotion to Major General in the Regulars, and in July, an appointment as Lieutenant Colonel of the new 7th U.S. Cavalry. This regiment was designed to be elite, specifically formed to quell hostile Indians on the western frontier. Custer's new posting would be Fort Riley, Cannes, where the regiment was to be organized and trained. Alongside him and Libbie, a diverse group of officers joined, including brother Tom, old friend George Yates, M. Hamilton, grandson of Alexander Hamilton, Miles Keogh, a dashing Irish soldier of fortune, Thomas Weir, a charming but hard-drinking Michigan officer who had served on Custer's Texas staff, and Frederick Benteen, a cranky but capable former volunteer colonel who immediately disliked Colonel Custer. With little time for training, the 7th was ordered west in March 1867 as part of Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's 400-man army to intimidate the Cheyennes and Sioux. Custer welcomed this, feeling that his regiment needed to be tested. He explained to Libbie, it was on the battlefield, when all faced death together, where the truest affection was formed among soldiers. However, this was not to be. Instead, Custer led his men in pursuit of an elusive foe, marching and counter-marching. By summer, he became surly and morose, and on July 15th, he decided to a man killed and another wounded by ambushing Indians. Forced march to Fort Harker, where he expected to reunite with Libbie. Captain Benteen took pleasure in Custer's discomfort, as he harbored a deep hatred for the man. He was also known for spreading gossip. Nevertheless, the accounts of others supported his stories of Custer's romantic involvements with other women, including another officer's wife and the Cheyenne captive Monacita. Benteen asserted, it was notorious that Custer was criminally intimate with a married woman, the wife of an officer of the garrison. He claimed that Libbie was aware of all this, which, he said, rendered her, if she had any heart, a broken-hearted woman. From knowing her as well as I do, I only remark that she was about as cold-blooded a woman as I ever knew, in which the pair were admirably mated. In a plaintive letter to Libbie, Custer admitted his failings. In a plaintive letter to Libbie, Custer admitted his failings. I was wrong, he wrote. I knew it then as plainly as I know it now. While I am absent, you may perhaps think kindly of me and remember much that is good of me, but when I return, that spark of distrust, which I alone am responsible for first placing in your mind, but which others have fanned into a flame, will be rekindled. He assured her, my love for you is as unquenchable as my life. No woman has nor ever can share my love with you. As there is to me but one God supreme and alone, there is also but one woman. At Fort Harker, Custer had a meeting with Lieutenant Tom Weir, who, if Benteen is to be believed, was the cause of the hurried journey. Benteen asserted that Custer had a physical altercation with Weir. An anonymous letter, written by Lieutenant Charles Brewster at the encouragement of Eliza, suggesting that Custer should look after his wife a little closer, was the catalyst for his ride to Harker. Lieutenant Edward Mathey later confirmed that Weir was the reason why Custer left his command without permission. Weir had indeed been Libbie's guardian during Custer's extended absence, rescuing her and Eliza from a June flood on Big Creek near Fort Hays, where 7 men drowned, accompanying her on lengthy evening strolls, in one instance of being mistaken by sentries for Indians and fired upon, and proving utterly charming to her, when not drinking. At the very least, the two engaged in a serious flirtation. Custer himself confirmed this when writing to Libbie in early 1869, stating, "The more I see of him, Weir, little one, the more I am surprised that a woman of your perceptive faculties and moral training could have entertained the opinion of him you have." Custer left a shaken Weir. It was the grandest romantic gesture possible. Finally, she had proven more important to him than anything else on earth, including his military career. There was in that summer of 1867 one long, perfect day, she later wrote. It was mine, and blessed be our memory which preserves to us the joys as well as the sadness of life. It is still mine, for time and for eternity. After the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Weir was assigned to recruiting duty in New York City. His health, and perhaps his mind, had been shattered by the events of June 25, 1876. He wrote Elizabeth repeatedly, promising to come to her side in Monroe. "I know if we were all alone in the parlor at night," he wrote her in November, "the curtains all down and everybody else asleep, one or the other of you would make me tell you everything I know." He never came. On December 9, 1876, she received a telegram informing her of his death. She wrote his doctor to inquire what had happened, for Weir was only 38. The doctor responded that the captain, in the advanced stages of alcoholism, had died of melancholia. What had he hoped to tell her? Probably that her husband's subordinates had failed him in every way at the Little Bighorn. Probably that Benteen had willfully ignored Custer's written order to reinforce him. Probably that Major Marcus Reno had been incompetent at best and cowardly at worst that day. And most certainly that he alone had responded to the sound of Custer's guns, ignoring Reno and Benteen and leading his company out alone to offer aid before a horde of Indians forced him back to Reno Hill. Why had he risked so much? Was it for his friends, for his honor, or for her? Such words might have comforted her as her husband's reputation was under attack. President Grant, Brig. General Terry, 7th Cavalry Colonel Samuel Sturgis, Major Reno, and Captain Benteen all blamed the defeat solely on Custer. Even Sheridan was strangely silent. If her husband's reputation was to be redeemed, Libbie would have to do it. And she did. First by cooperating with writer Frederick Whitaker in rushing a laudatory biography of Custer into print, and then by pressuring Sheridan to re-enter George's remains at West Point. The other officers, including Tom Custer, Yates, and Calhoun, were buried at Fort Leavenworth. Margaret Calhoun and Annie Yates attended the Leavenworth services. Then Margaret, along with her father and Mrs. Lawrence Barrett, joined Libbie at West Point on October 10, 1877, for Custer's reburial. Libbie's crusade had just begun. She worked, and in time statues went up at West Point, at his birthplace in New Rumley, Ohio, and in Monroe. Libbie so disliked the foppish West Point statue that she had it removed. Its pedestal formed a new monument over her husband's grave. More important, she wrote 3 memoirs of her frontier adventures with the General, as she always called him. Boots and Saddles, published to great acclaim in 1885, was followed by Tenting on the Plains in 1887 and Following the Guidon in 1890. This trilogy, as well as lectures she gave, restored George's reputation while also securing for her the financial security he had failed to provide. She made New York City her home, and there closed herself off to other relationships, devoting herself completely to enhancing her husband's memory through her perfect widowhood. The hours that one sees people and keeps up the farce of perpetual happiness are few compared with the never-ending hours when one is alone with the past, and all those who were nearest have gone to the country from which no traveler returns. Libbie Custer died in her Park Avenue apartment of a heart attack on April 4, 1933, 4 days short of her 91st birthday. Born during the administration of President John Tyler, she had lived into the century of airplanes, automobiles, world wars, female suffrage, motion pictures, and the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They buried her at West Point in the shadow of her husband's monument. On her simple headstone is carved Elizabeth Bacon, wife of George A. Custer, Major General USA. She must have been content, for just as she had helped to shape her flawed husband in life, working through their marital strife to find true happiness together, she had also molded the towering image of the golden-haired cavalier the world now embraced.